Next, I want to show you a slightly larger application. It's still not very large, but it's, 5 or 6 files. It's a web app, a server, there's a database involved. It's basic authentication, but really nothing impressive. But it's a step up from what we've done so far, DVD logo moving around on a screen. And instead of coding it along with you, it could be like an hour-long video. I think it's just a waste of your time. I went ahead and built it on my own using ChatGPT. There's a whole bunch of chat stuff here. And I just want to walk you through some of the issues I ran into, some of the iterative chat that I've mentioned a whole bunch of times in this section that works best when you're trying to get ChatGPT to write you code, especially when that code is complicated and interconnected instead of just a one-off function or script. Okay, so what I wanted it to do is build me a link or a URL shortener, a very dumbed down version of something like Bitly, where you can provide a long URL, and then it takes that long URL, stores it in a database, along with a shortened version that it generates, right? A unique short link. And then I can use that short link to visit my long link. And I, this time around, decided to use Python with Flask and SQLite. And I use SQLite just to keep it simpler, not having to worry about, database authentication or something with MySQL. Okay. So the first thing I said is really short. I want to implement a simple URL shortener using Python. I'd like to use Flask and SQLite. And it immediately just started going. And this time around, it did tell me a bit about what I needed to install, although it didn't mention virtual environments, creating a requirements file for pip. There's some things it left off. But again, this is for experienced developers anyway. It's mostly just highlighting the key points. Here's a basic project structure. And then it did something that confused me a tiny bit. It gave me one version of app.py with some imports and my basic server. And then it gave me another version of app.py. And what confused me for a moment is that it's also importing Flask, just like it was in this version. So I just followed up saying, is this one file, 2 files? Further down here. And it said, I apologize for the confusion. They should be in the same file, and it consolidated the imports and gave me everything together. It would have been simple enough to figure out. It wasn't some crazy issue, but it just had some overlap. Then it also gave me a couple of really basic templates, index.html, url.html, where it eventually is going to render the shortened URL. And then it told me, here's how you run your application. Sure. Although I usually use Flask run instead of Python app.py. Fine enough. It gave me some explanation, told me to replace the test database URL with the location of my actual SQLite database, set my Flask environment variables, and then, it actually did tell me to use Flask run, even though it told me to use Python up here. Slightly confusing, but simple enough to figure out. Okay. Then I ran into a legitimate issue, which is it wrote code that caused an error. It was a pretty simple error to fix, but this is the error I was getting down here, working outside of application context. And this is coming from SQL Alchemy, Flask SQL Alchemy, which is the library that connects SQL to Flask, or one of the libraries that does that. And it all stems from this line. So it figured it out just fine. This is a very simple thing to fix. It basically just put this line db.createAll on its own, which is invalid. It does not work that way. And if you looked at the SQL Alchemy docs, it'd be the first thing you could identify as a developer anyway. So another example of it writing incorrect code that with a tiny little nudge, just showing it the error message, it solved. It rewrote the code correctly, and it modifies it so that it runs the line now right here with app.appContext, which is the correct way of running db.createAll. Okay, then I asked it some more questions to update the template so that I could put localhost in here, because right now it's, I'm not hosting this anywhere except locally on my machine. Not a big deal, simple enough. Then I asked it to generate me some simple HTML and make it look great. I don't know if it made it look great, but it wrote me some styles. It tends to favor putting inline styling, or not inline, but an inline style tag, which is obnoxious. I just went with it for the sake of time. This took me, an hour of playing around with to generate this whole chat transcript. Anyway, it puts the CSS right in the template, kind of annoying, but easy enough to solve. It writes some styles, and the styles look pretty okay, and they're organized well enough, and I was happy enough with those. And then further down, kept going, gave me another template, and it claims that it gives them a clean, modern look, but they're quite simple, and that they're for demonstration purposes only, and that it wants me to use Tailwind or Bootstrap for more comprehensive styles. Okay. Then I just asked it, what other features can I add? And it suggested authentication. It also suggested possibly adding testing. So I asked it to write me some tests, write a basic but comprehensive test suite. So it told me to install Flask-testing, and then it told me to make a testapp.py file. It's using unit tests, Flask testing, and it writes some basic tests. And they work decently well. I tried them out. It was fine. The logic of my application is dead simple. You provide a URL and you get back a short URL, and that's pretty much it. There's not a whole lot to test other than that. Then it gives me a super long explanation of how the tests work. And then I told it to add some simple authentication. So this is one of those things where, auth is a pain for a lot of people, and it would be nice to turn to something like ChatGPT to get help with. But you have to be careful, because it's one thing if you get a function that seems to work, but it actually has bugs. It's another thing if you take authentication code that's supposed to protect your application and it has a bug baked in or it doesn't work. It could cause a lot of problems. The stakes are higher, I guess that's what I'm trying to say with authentication. But it did an okay job. It told me to use Flask login, so install that, update my app.py to have some authentication logic in here using Flask login. It adds in a login method, a logout method. Looks fine enough, a load user helper, and it did a pretty good job at least getting the authentication up and running. It adds my forms in, but then I got an error again. Create all got an unexpected keyword argument app. And if you look where this is coming from, right here, create all app equals app. This is exactly what it told me to do. And then I told it, wait, that gave me an error, and it immediately apologizes. Another instance of it making a mistake, introducing a bug, using incorrect syntax. But when it's called out, it says, oh, wait a minute, the correct usage of that create all method does not include any params. And it tells me to change it from what it suggested to this right here, db.createAll. And also, once again, wrap it inside of this context. So just a small little bug here or there that if you don't know what you're doing, could be annoying to fix, but I would never suggest somebody who's a complete beginner try and use ChatGPT to make an application in the first place. If you are a developer, though, it can help. Then I said, all right, we have authentication. Theoretically, right, we have our routes, but there's no way to actually register. And it said, oh, I assumed you would manually add users to the database. So then it gave me a register route. It created the template for me. I went through all of this, and it works fine enough. You can register. But then I got another error, template not found. And it turned out that it was redirecting me to a route and a template that didn't exist. It keeps referencing home, which it never told me to actually create. And so then eventually, once I told it, hey, there's no home.html file, I got this error, it responds, oh, you need to make that file. Here's what could go in that file. So just a little nudging in the right direction, iterating, kind of working with it, being a supervisor, you can get some good results. And that's where I left off. And I'll just briefly show you that it does kind of work for the most part. I'm currently logged in. Let me log out. If I try and go to the root page, just slash, it keeps redirecting me to login. So that is a protected route. If we go back to the app.py, the home route, where are you? Right here, has the login required decorator on it. Okay, so if I try and go to the home page, it doesn't work. I can't shorten URLs unless I'm logged in. So let's register. I'll register with my dog's name, Elton, and then I'll put a password. A really weak one matches his username of Elton. Okay, kind of annoying. It just redirects me to the login page, which it's simple enough to, we could ask it for help on that. But I'll log back in as Elton. And now it takes me to the URL Shortener. This is the protected route I couldn't visit. Now I'll provide a URL like This is just from my personal webpage for one of my free courses. I'll put that in here. It's not that long of a URL anyway, but imagine it is long. And I'm going to shorten it. And this is when it generates me. And when I click on this, it does in fact take me to the correct URL. Although it's displaying the wrong URL, it's not displaying the local host that it needs to use. It's just doing HTTP. That's easy enough to change, right? It's just in the template, but it is working. So that's not bad. The styles are okay, right? I can shorten another URL. I can log out. Some of the routes are protected by authentication, but it's not perfect. I mean, I actually just asked it, what are some security issues or problems with the current authentication setup? And one big one is that there's no validation on your registration. You can register with the same email over and over and over, and there's no error handling whatsoever. There's no session management, really. The secret key is hard-coded right now into the application. So just a lot of things that in the real world would be real problems, but it's at least able to highlight them. So you just have to be aware, right? This is not a friendly process for a complete beginner. You could make a really bad, very vulnerable and buggy application if you don't know how to code. If you do know what you're doing and you oversee it, you manage ChatGPT, you can get pretty far. I mean, this took me, I said an hour, it's probably more like 40 minutes to get a basic app up and running with authentication, a database, 4 or 5 routes, 4 or 5 templates, what else? Redirection, some authorization, plus the URL shortening logic, plus a couple of tests. So that might take me twice as long to do if I was doing it myself without ChatGPT. And I'm going to end this video here. I'm still not happy with a lot of things. The CSS directly in the HTML template's obnoxious. The lack of, any sort of validations, not to mention client-side validations for the authentication. That all sucks. No error handling. But it's just a matter of revisiting ChatGPT and telling it what we want, right? My next step could easily be, okay, let's add some registration validation. I'm not going to do it, but is it registration? Registration. Oh gosh. I think it's, yeah. My spelling is terrible. I'm sorry. Let's add some registration validation. Let's check if the username already exists. Simple things that if you've ever written authentication, you would know to do, at least if you've used any of these libraries, but it's pretty basic. Look to see if, the email or the username Elton exists in the database first. If so, we're going to respond back and flash a message saying username already exists, redirect them back to the register page. Also, we could add some client-side validations with JavaScript, but that's it. It is definitely possible to get a lot out of ChatGPT as a developer assistant, a helper, but you're not going to get very far if you're relying on it exclusively. As we've already seen, it introduced 2 or 3 completely invalid lines of code that broke the application more than once.